So maybe you can just say a couple of words, each of you, about your backgrounds, and then we can really reflect together on this theme of the week, ascensions and responsibility in critical times, and what's come out of the meeting for you so far on that.
Sure. Phap Linh, why don't you start?
No. You're my elder.
I'm Jay, and I'm an academic. I'm a professional philosopher, and I teach at universities and colleges. So I'm very much a theory guy, and I come at Buddhism with that orientation. That is to try to understand the ideas, the theories, the history of Buddhist ideas, and how best to apply those theories in the contemporary world. So a lot of my work is on the interface of bringing Asian Buddhism and Western Buddhism together, Western philosophy and Buddhist philosophy together. But I'm really in it for the ideas and for understanding the fundamental nature of reality, for understanding what it is to be a human being, for understanding the ethical orientation that Buddhism offers us. And for me, coming here is valuable partly because I get to rub shoulders with monastics and people with a lot of experiential understanding of Buddhism, but also with scientists who are doing the empirical work that is relevant to Buddhist thought.
Thank you. Yeah, so my name is Brother Phap Linh, also known as Brother Spirit. I'm a monk. I've been a monk for some number of years in Plum Village, ordained by Zen Master Thich Nhat Hanh, my teacher, and I had the great good fortune in this life to encounter him at the age of 19 and to eventually finally have the good sense to jump in and sort of get the more daily training of being a monk. And I find myself very fully kind of stimulated and switched on by this meeting of all these different traditions, the philosophical, the intellectual, the sort of theoretical, also scientific. I find myself coming from not really ever working as a professional scientist, but with a sort of scientific, self-selected scientific upbringing, in the way I chose to educate myself as a teenager and then studied mathematics at university. And so, it's an important way of knowing, way of investigating for me. And I'm also very, I have a sense, an intuition that the meeting of these different streams is important to meet also the crisis, the polycrisis, the situation, the global situation we find ourselves in. And more recently, I'm sensing the importance of, in a sense, challenging the ubiquity or the hegemonic power of scientific materialism. As you spoke about finding out what is the nature of reality. I think that was the term you used. And what I'm interested in particularly is that, for sure, that coming at it from all these different streams, intellectual, philosophical, theoretical, and practice, direct sort of meditative experience. And in a sense, what I'm getting from the last few days is the possibility of a kind of microphenomenology of where this belief system, or maybe you could call it naive realism, the sense that there is a real, solid, existing, physical world which is independent of consciousness, where that comes into play, even for those of us who say we are spiritual or have a spiritual practice. Because I think it's so it's colonized our thinking to such an extent that a lot of the time it's there and we're acting by and from it without necessarily being aware of it. So that's my current passion in a sense.
Yeah, I'm definitely with you on that. And I guess I think this is one of those places that is trying to explore the origin of what you're calling naive realism, what I like to just call following the sorrel, the natural attitude, right? The way we naturally fall into understanding our experience in the world, where that comes from, and why it's so compelling. And I guess I think that it's the integration of these perspectives that's so valuable to coming to understand that. So here's a kind of, I don't know, a brute way to put that. I am more and more convinced, both through studying the history of philosophy and through philosophical reflection, some of it guided by the Buddhist tradition, where I spend a lot of my time, some of it guided by the Western tradition, where I spend a lot of my time, and some of it guided by neuroscience. I think that we really are evolutionarily wired to take the deliverances of our senses as veridical and as delivering a world that exists independently of our perception exactly as we see it. And so when in Buddhism we talk about the root delusions that give rise to the suffering of cyclic existence, and we say there's three of them. There's attraction and aversion that are proximal, but those are grounded in what I call primal confusion, right? And what is primal confusion? Well, confusion means running two things together, right? And the confusion here is confusing our experience with the world that we experience, and taking that experience to be just something that's transparently delivering reality and bringing it into our heads, and there it is. And we actually know you don't have to be brilliant, and you don't have to be a meditator, and you don't have to be a philosopher or even a scientist to get this, right? I mean, if I'm looking at you, you know roughly what's happening. Light is bouncing off of you, and it's entering my eye, and it's getting refracted through a bunch of clear jelly and turned upside down, and it's causing photoelectric effects on the back of my eye, and electrical impulses to go through two streams to my occipital cortex, and a bunch of electrical stuff happening. And you don't look anything like that to me, right? And certainly nothing that looks like you is inside my skull. So we know that that's how vision works, and that the you that I see is a complete construction of my visual system. The illusion is taking it to be more than that, right? To reify that construction and to take it as reality. And I think that permeates our thinking. And so I take the task of philosophical reflection, the task of science, and the task of practice to try to undo that confusion. That's the only way out of samsara, right?
Yes.
That's the only way out.
Yes.
And it turns out to be hard. So in Buddhism, we talk about karma from beginningless time, potentials in the alley of vijnana. Those are absolutely fabulous metaphors. And I see them as just metaphors for a really unfortunate evolutionary history that had tremendous survival advantage, right?
Yes.
But is terrible metaphysics.
Yeah. So I would take that and sort of, in a way, try to even step one pace back from that framing. Because I wonder if even that, the framing that you've just offered us, kind of sits within an idea of a physical world.
It does.
She talks about light dancing, operating those and doing all kinds of stuff. And so kind of with a bit of, due deference to the phenomenological tradition as well, it's like, can we also suspend that?
Yeah.
And come back to a sort of directness of experience, but not with the idea of then creating a world system or trying to, map or understand the nature of reality, but just kind of seeing without prior concepts.
And I think that's the nature of the dialectic, right? So what I did was the first step.
Yes.
There's a line from the Lankavatara Sutra that I always think that almost everybody should write in red lipstick on their mirror, so it's the first thing they see every morning. And it's, this triple world is not as it appears, nor is it otherwise.
Yes.
And it's the nor is it otherwise that's so important. Because by doing the kind of cognitive exercise that I just did, which is just, pretty flat-footed, and I always start there, because if you're talking to somebody who's entranced by this kind of natural attitude and this naive realism, I think it's nice to start with their own perspective.
Fair
and
enough.
show how that undermines their own view, right? But that's only the beginning of the dialectic.
Yeah.
Because what we got was not an account of how the world is. We got another account of how the world appears.
Yes.
Right? And the fact is that you have to be willing to do that at every stage of the dialectic. That's what Nagarjuna means by the emptiness of emptiness. When we talk about things being empty, what we mean is that when you look for their fundamental nature, you don't find anything. Not that you find emptiness, that you don't find anything. And you only fail to find anything when you've looked every place.
Yes.
And looking every place really is an endless task. But you can begin to see where it's going to go after you've taken a few steps down that road.
Right. You get a taste for
You
it.
get a taste, and you get to see, I know where this rabbit hole ends. It doesn't. Right? That's the leap from the cliff. And that can be transformative. And so I guess I think that the kind of analysis that I just suggested is always only a beginning.
Yes.
Because you've really got to be willing to say, oh.
Yeah. So what I suppose, if I can sort of bring us back also to the framing of this whole exercise within the moment that we find ourselves historically as humanity facing potential, climate catastrophe of various kinds, pollution, global heating, biodiversity loss, and so on and so on and so on, the social crises, the inequality, injustice,
inequality, starvation, all these good things.
Modern slavery, the whole enchilada. What interests me, one of the many things that interest me, but this sort of sense that, so I really liked your framing of naive realism as the natural attitude, which is sort of has an evolutionary force behind it, massive evolutionary force for just what worked, what got us, able to survive to this point. But I feel like now we have another force, which is the instrumental power of science, which then goes to potentially, if we're not good scientists, it reinforces, can reinforce that natural attitude. And make it just seem like, oh, well, now that is just the nature of reality. That's what's real. That's what's solid. That's what's reliable. And so then when we face massive existential crisis, as I think we are in fact facing, then I think what it leads us to do is to think, well, in order to solve this crisis, we are within this real, physical, solid world. And so the only levers that we have to pull on are the levers of, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the number of trees, or, population, food production, basically physical stuff that we can change. And the only agents who are able to move those levers are human beings. So in a way, everything I'm doing right now is sort of trying to challenge that framing to kind of ask, are there any other agentic forces at play? What would it mean to invoke spirituality in that context as a power for change, which is also why I'm interested in the sort of joining of these streams of science and Buddhism and also all other spiritualities. What does that mean? And I think the sort of exercise that we were then starting to do of kind of re-examining and questioning all those frames is part of that deconstruction and an invitation to re-experience what is even this, what is interaction, what is self, separateness, and all these things.
If you decide that the only grown-ups in the room are the people in the white lab coats, then you're really in trouble, right? And honestly, I think that one of the most refreshing things, here's the plug time, about a Mind and Life event like this, is that while those folks are in the room, there's also folks in brown robes in the room, folks in red robes in the room. It'd be nice if there were some with gray robes in the room, yellow robes, but then there's also people who don't wear robes at all, or even white coats like me. And one of the things that I like is that this is a room where people have actually come with a level of humility, trust, and goodwill. And I often see those three things as what's missing in public dialogues. A lack of humility means, hey, look, leave it to us. We've got the answers. We know how to do the engineering. Or leave it to us. We know that science is completely foolish and got us into this. So don't worry, we spiritual folks will save
We're going to
everybody.
pray our way out of this.
Exactly, right. That's the lack of humility. Or there's a lack of trust, right? That is, you think, well, these are the guys who got us in here. Why are we talking to them now? Or look at what's happened in the history of religion. Why are we listening to these people? Or philosophers. Oh my God, right?
Where did they ever get us?
Exactly. What have they ever done for the world? So if you don't have that kind of trust and that kind of goodwill and that kind of humility, the dialogue never gets going, and the dialogue is necessary. And somehow what happens at an event like this is people come together with those attitudes.
Can I add one more strand
Yeah.
to that trio, right? You had trust, humility,
and goodwill.
and goodwill. And I would add practice,
Yeah.
meaning some kind of meditative practice, of which, of course, there are many, many different kinds.
Yeah.
But I think when we come into this space, what I'm finding so exciting is meeting people who I can sense, I can feel that whilst we may be talking in theoretical terms, they can be relating in their own experience to a kind of, direct experience of what it is that we're then kind of putting into linguistic and theoretical terms. And I find that is also sometimes lacking when we have these types of discussions, because I sort of feel like it's not really going to be possible to find our way out of this maze unless we also have the capacity to dance that dance, to kind of get out of the linguistic framing of things, to try to come back to what are these words even pointing to as experiences. Yes, so I would like to talk to you about something that we touched on yesterday briefly, which is map making, or kind of descriptions of reality.
Yeah.
So I made a comment, which is that I have the sense that the type of, I said Buddhism a bit sort of monolithically, and then I took it back, but the sense that the Buddhism I have learned and studied from have been transmitted from my teacher, and that I practice, I tried to practice, as far as I understand, is not trying to make a description of reality, right? And that doesn't mean that it doesn't use things that look like descriptions of reality along the way, right? So there are models, like the 5 skandhas is a model, is a kind of description, is a map. But what I find fascinating about Buddhism is the sense in which there is always a warning to, at some point, relinquish the map or the model. So the reason I'm saying that is I think it's also an interesting counterpoint to the scientific tradition, which is very good at map making, model making. And if I'm coming along and saying, well, we should release scientism or physicalism, then the tendency might be to say, okay, so what alternative model of reality are you proposing? And I'm trying to say, I'm not proposing an alternative. What I'm proposing is a sort of epistemic humility, a kind of attitude of maximal openness, of not knowing, of beginner's mind. Well, I wonder where that takes us, if anything.
I think it's a really interesting idea. And I guess, as I said yesterday, I'd be really careful about how far we generalize that in the Buddhist framework. So, for instance, what I was thinking of is the great Abhidharmika tradition, which offers us a very detailed model of cognitive processes and so forth, and is really deeply embedded in a very delicate map making, maybe so delicate that it ends up looking like Borges's map. That's just as, the same as the terrain that
coextensive with the world. Yeah.
But I think that's there in Buddhism as well, and it's not there in every strand of Buddhism. So Buddhism's a big world, but let's leave that aside for a minute, because that's really not what we care about. The one way to think about the alternative, to stay within the Buddhist tradition, is to focus on one of my favorite words in, say, Sanskrit or Tibetan, avatar, or Tibetan, to engage. So when we say, take a text like, Majjhimaka avatar, engage in the middle way, right? So when we think about that, I think about Buddhist philosophy, that's where I come, but also Buddhist practice, as offering us a way to engage with others, to engage with the world, And that's different from standing back and mapping it. Because part of what's weird about the map analogy, I mean, you've focused on the idea that the map never it has all of the information that's in the original and gives you the illusion that it does. That's right. And that's part of the danger of maps.
Yes.
But there's a different danger as well. The other danger is that using a map always encodes a subject-object duality.
Yeah. Standing back.
It creates that distance. And even if we think of those maps as something we've internalized, cognitive maps, when we use a cognitive map or think of the way we react to the world as by constructing a map of it and then using that map, we do the following crazy thing. We say, okay, there's us and there's the world.
Yes.
There's my representation and there's the world. Or if we're reading Wittgenstein's Tractatus, to come back to your days in Cambridge, there's language and then there's the world. Or there's thought and then there's the world. And I just want to say that that's one of the dumbest ideas that people ever came up with. Because the last time I looked, our heads are in the world, that language is happening in the world, that our thoughts are happening in the world. And we're not standing against the world, representing it, and then operating on a representation that then connects to the world. I don't even know what that would mean, okay? I can't even make sense of that. So when we get a picture theory of language, and Wittgenstein says that a picture represents reality, how does it do it? It reaches right out to it. Well, does that mean it's an unreal picture reaching out to reality? Because if reality's over here and the picture's here, the picture isn't real. So how do unreal pictures do that? And is the reaching real or unreal? I mean, give me a break, right? So I think what's really wrong with that image is not the lack of detail. And it's not the error either. It's the whole picture.
Yes.
That somehow we separate ourselves from one another, from the world, and then that's what the relationship is.
Yes.
And that's why I like the language of engagement. When you engage, you're right together like this. When the gears of a car engage, when you let out the clutch, they're not looking at each other, they're meshed with each other. Everything's in the same place.
Yes.
And that's, I think, what Buddhist philosophy at its best offers us as an alternative, not an alternative representation, but an alternative to representation.
Yes.
As a way of thinking about what we're doing.
Yes, excellent. And that's, I think, what I'm sort of most interested in bringing to scientists and sort of explicating to scientists as a way of, as a kind of invitation to the kind of science that we could do, in which we don't make that mistake of sort of believing that there is something standing back from the model and looking at it, or standing back from reality, looking at a map, looking at the reality through all these sort of layers of abstraction. Because I think the current situation we find ourselves in also is that the map, which includes language, language as a map of reality, because there's feedback at every level, right? So we think in language, we think in linguistic terms, and that conditions our ability to perceive things, and we're constantly in a game of reification.
And we introspect in terms of language too.
Exactly.
People forget that, right?
Self-narration.
When I say, oh, right now I'm thinking that dance, I'm putting a sentence in my head.
Yes. And it's exhausting, and it doesn't lead to much freedom or satisfaction, to my understanding.
Nor to good science.
Right, exactly. And then I think the next layer of mistake that we make within that whole system is that when we encounter phenomena, the first thing we do is measure them against the map, rather than just saying, there is a phenomenon.
Exactly.
Let's
engage with it.
Let's engage, yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that we are, again and again, caught by that sort of reversal. There's been a kind of sleight of hand moment where language has come into our consciousness, sort of colonized our way of being, our way of conceiving, to the extent that, and this is very much to do with the sort of narrative self.
Absolutely.
That then we measure language, reality, or even our own sort of very direct, intimate experience against narrative frames and ways of understanding, which then completely condition or limit or sort of exclude the possibility of many varieties of arising.
And what that means is that one of the deepest illusions to which we are subject, and the one that in some ways, once you see it, is the scariest one, is the illusion that when we look inside at our own minds, we see our minds just as they are, instead of our minds as they appear to us.
Yes.
Our minds as we've decided to model through language.
Yes.
And
There's the illusion of clarity.
the illusion of immediacy.
Yes.
And the illusion of clarity, which just terrifies me. Because that's the sneakiest one, right? Because you think, well, how could anything get between me and my own mind? And the answer is easy.
Very easy.
Yeah.
Really.
And all
Many,
the
many
way
levels.
all the way.
Sort of subtler levels.
Yeah.
Yes. And yet, is there the possibility of some form of immediacy? And when we speak about bringing our attention back to the breath, to sensation in the body, what I experience is, I find it interesting, just to note for a moment that we generally tend as human beings to search for pleasant sensations and to pull away from unpleasant sensations.
Yeah.
And even in the meditative field or sort of game, a lot of people are searching for more and more pleasant sensations or the complete elimination of unpleasant sensations. Unpleasant mental states, feelings, physical feelings, looking for bliss states and so on. So what I find it very interesting to do is to sort of decouple the labeling, the valence, that arrives pre-given sometimes. It's like, this is pleasant, this is unpleasant.
Yeah.
And to re-examine, to sort of suspend all of that machinery and sort of say, oh, what if the present moment is not, my attention often is sort of misdirected onto the content of experience, and whether I like it or dislike it. What if I could sort of pay attention not to the content but to the fact of experience, and just notice, oh, there is experience. It has, can be characterized as pleasant or unpleasant or neutral. But that doesn't matter. Like the experienceness of experience is kind of thrilling, even if I'm in pain or experiencing sadness or anger or something else. And so I wonder, is there a possibility of immediacy, or am I still fooling myself there? Is there something getting in between?
I'm going to be really mean right now.
Sure.
I think you're fooling yourself. I think that any time I look inside and say, there's immediacy, the moment I said that, I've mediated it.
But if I didn't say it, if I felt it,
then
if I managed, and it's difficult, I acknowledge it's very difficult, but if I managed not to be commenting on it or narrating it, but if I could just settle into the non-verbal experience of it, what then?
Well, I don't actually know what then, because the issue is that that's a matter of having experience, but that by itself doesn't end up giving me knowledge of experience, right? This is the point that Tsongkhapa makes very beautifully, right? When he says that when we're in meditative equipoise, and we have non-conceptual, non-verbal experience, grant all of that, he says you don't have knowledge till you come out of meditative equipoise and reflect the subsequent attainment, the subsequent knowledge that reflects back on it and takes it as an object. Now I can know something about it. But what Tsongkhapa is directing us to is the moment it comes to be knowledge, something we can do, we're back to mediation.
Yes.
And of course, you and I come from very different traditions. I'm coming out of a Tibetan Gelug tradition, and we tend to be eggheads.
Yes.
And you're coming out of a Chinese tradition that valorizes a non-conceptual kind of apprehension, and we tend to look with a little bit of suspicion at that.
Fair enough.
But that's fair enough. So what I wouldn't want to do is to say, we're right and you're wrong. Nor would I want to say the other.
Very helpful.
I would want to say that I get really suspicious whenever anything starts looking too immediate. Whenever I feel Like there's no space between my experience and what I'm experiencing. I begin to think I'm fooling myself. Because I think of my mind as a kind of automatic mediator. And I think of my job in philosophical and meditative reflection to become aware of that mediation, to become aware of the fact that I'm making those mistakes, to try to pare them away, but to recognize the endlessness of that paring away, and to see that, well, maybe at some point I can sum all of that up. So, what I'm thinking of, to take an analogy from your past, I'm thinking of transfine induction right now. So I see this whole infinite series of bracketings, and I say, sum all of that up.
I see.
And that omega state is what I'm after.
Yeah.
But
I like that metaphor too, the kind of, it's a kind of asymptotic approach to the present moment.
yes.
And I wonder, how far up that curve can you accelerate? And is there a point where you sort of go superluminal and you...
And the fact is I don't. And the fact is I don't know. And I don't want to pretend that I do. But I think that just making ourselves aware of the depth and the pervasiveness of cognitive illusion helps us to move from reacting to the contents of our illusions to responding to what's actually around us. Even if that responsiveness isn't perfect, it's better than the reactivity that the dualism gives us, right? And it's that reactivity that's got us to where we are now, because that's what gives us attraction, aversion. That's what tells us we've got to get rich the hell with the world. That's what tells us that, we don't want to pay attention to these people, so let's just keep doing what we're doing. And anything we can do to make that transition from reaction to responsiveness, I think is an improvement. And that to some extent, this is like a real torturing of the arrow parable. But at some point I want to say, and I want to leave aside whether there's an end to this. I want to leave aside whether perfection is possible. Perfectibility is all I want.
It's good enough.
Yes. If I've got a direction,
Yes.
then all I need to do on any path at any moment is take one more step.
Yes.
That's it.
Yes.
And I don't need to worry about where that path ends or whether it ends. And I tend to think that way.
No, I like that. I like that framing. I maybe I'll offer one more framing that I, will do humility I received from a teacher. So he speaks about the ultimate dimension and the historical. And in a sense, the task of engaged Buddhism is to be able to move smoothly from the one to the other. So he came up with the Z of Zorro. So you might have the ultimate here, or let's say here's the historical, and from the historical, by looking more and more deeply into the part of the historical, we find the ultimate. And when we found the ultimate, we don't just stay there or go and retreat into a cave and disengage from everything. In fact, we go back and we bring the flavor of the ultimate into our action, into our engagement, because maybe that gives us a sense of freedom, we have a lightness, we're less pushed and pulled by the world, we're less in the reactive mode. So we had a little taste of that freedom.
And that's coming out of Nagarjuna.
Yes.
It's coming out of chapter 24 of Mogamajamika, where Nagarjuna reminds us both that we need to keep the distinction between the conventional and the ultimate in mind. Because if we don't understand the conventional, we'll never understand the ultimate. And if we don't understand the ultimate, we won't get liberation. But then comes around a few verses later to remind us whatever is dependent origination is emptiness. And that is just a dependent designation. That's just something we say. And that is the middle way. So that we have to understand both the distinction between the two truths and their identity. And Jay Tsongkhapa puts it beautifully when he says, the relationship between the conventional and the ultimate is that they're extensionally equivalent and intentionally distinct. And I think that's just beautiful.
Yes.
And that's why the conventional is so important.
Yes.
Not just because it's a part of the ladder, but because if you disparage the conventional, you disparage the ultimate.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's all we've got.
I think this is a mistake that I made a lot when I first encountered this framing, and partly it comes from the translation, ultimate, because it sounds like ultimate is sort of better.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and it sounds like the historical is the one that you kind of got to get rid of. It's false, it's illusory. It's
Truth for dummies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it took me a long time to realize that no, it's only in the sort of the equipoise of both and the non-superiority.
The total interpenetration.
Yes. Yeah.
Totally.
Two truths perfectly woven together.
That's right.
Yes.
I think that that's just so important, because it is so tempting to denigrate the conventional, and it's so dumb to do that.
And so that brings us back potentially to this question of scientific materialism,
Yeah.
physicalism, which we could roughly equate to the conventional. I mean, not really, but it's a map of the conventional. It's a way of framing our understanding of the conventional. You can put it like that.
Yeah, that's one way. Here's another way, and they're both good, which
Yes.
is kind of cool, because you can also see the whole scientific image as the suggestion that this everyday world of people and statues and stuff, that's just the conventional, and science is giving us the ultimate. And then this kind of scientism says, so this conventional stuff, it's just an illusion. It's not real. None of
Cognitive
it's
illusion.
real.
Yeah.
What's real are just the protons and electrons.
Atoms,
Or what's
particles.
real are just the wave functions. Or whatever, forget whatever it is, right? And to really reify that vision of the ultimate as opposed to the conventional. And what they forget is that what they need in order to even say that is the notion of just consciousness,
Yes.
right? And the notion of justification and norms and methods and evidence. And those are all norms within what they've just described as the everyday conventional world of dumb old people,
Yes.
right? So you cannot, even on the scientist's own view, get their own view of the ultimate without keeping the conventional.
Yes.
Almost any set of metaphors you use for thinking about the two truths forces you back to the conclusion that the two truths are one.
Yes.
And then if you forget that, then nothing is going to make any sense.
I personally kind of strongly resist the temptation to say, for example, Newtonian physics, that's the conventional, and quantum, that's the ultimate. I find that's
just dumb.
really wrong-headed.
Yeah, they're each attempts to sketch the ultimate.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Of varying degrees of,
Precision.
Yeah.
But the same degree of conceptual confusion.
Mm-hmm.
Different degrees of precision, but the same conceptual confusion.
Yes.
But somehow just getting the mathematics right
Yes.
is going to characterize ultimate truth, and then we can do away with the convention.
Right.
Then we don't need people anymore because we've got the formulas.
But that's this reification of mathematics.
Exactly.
So, I have a question.
Okay, good.
Sort of vague, but forming. What is to be done?
What is to be done?
It's kind of Tolstoy question.
That's the huge question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So where do we, we have all of this
Let's start there. Then,
understanding, theoretical frameworks. We can dance around it. We can talk around it. We can sort of maybe touch it a little bit in our meditative experience. We can speak about it with greater or lesser degrees of eloquence. But how do we bring that to, say, the politicians,
Yeah.
the activists, the people who are already suffering the tragic consequences of climate change,
Yep.
of injustice,
Okay.
of colonial, repercussions, and all of these things?
Let's begin there. That's the deep and the hard question. And on the one hand, I'm tempted to say that part of the tragedy of each of our positions is that we are regarded by many, perhaps correctly, as among the least influential kinds of people in the world, people whom it's really easy to ignore. And I think we have to kind of face that as part of our own personal challenges. Nobody comes to us for advice from positions of power. I haven't.
Not quite true.
Yeah.
At least on this side of the fence, but yeah.
Yeah. But we, on the other hand, we have to also face the fact that we do have tremendous impact.
Yeah.
We have impact in the people we teach. We have impact in the public engagement that we do. we have impact through our writing, and we have to take that very seriously. And to be thinking fairly constantly about how to mobilize our ideas.
Yes.
Now, one thing that I've been thinking lately, maybe correctly, maybe incorrectly, is that the Brahma viharas give us enormous leverage there. And I've been quite taken by Buddhaghosa's account of the Brahma viharas and the relation between them and their near enemies. And Buddhaghosa's really dazzling insight that what makes the near enemies is their egocentricity.
Right.
And that what makes them so dangerous is that they feel so much like virtue, right? So for example, the near enemy of friendliness, of Maitri, is partiality, where I say, I'm really good at getting my students jobs instead of her students, right? I'm really good at making sure my kids do well and better than everybody else's. I'm a great parent, I'm a great teacher because I do well for my own, right? And that feels really good. People say, yeah, he's really loyal and so forth, but that's a near enemy, obviously. And so I've been thinking that in one way of addressing for us, people like us to be addressing the climate crisis, I can't build windmills, right? But what I can do is help people to see when they're acting out of a Brahma vihara and when they're acting out of a near enemy. Because I think that if climate activists, if anti-nuclear activists, if anti-war activists, if anti-racism activists act out of egocentric attitudes, they are absolutely doomed to failure. But if they act out of genuinely egoless aspirations instead of egoistic desires, they have a chance at success. And that's not just pie in the sky bullshit, right?
That's trainable.
That's Gandhi, that's Martin Luther King, that's Tolstoy, as you mentioned before,
Yes.
right?
And they are in a direct lineage.
Exactly. And so I think that what we can do is not, necessarily canvas for politicians, not design better airplanes or things like that, but we can help create the next generation of activists in a way and provide them with the analytical tools and the personal attitudes that enable them to be effective.
Yes. Could you, for the purpose of this discussion, give us the 4 Brahma viharas and
Sure. So one Brahma vihara is Maitri, or I like friendliness. Other people like loving kindness.
I like friendliness too.
I like friendliness.
And it comes from the root mitra.
Mitra,
which is
same
friend,
word.
so,
Yeah, exactly. It might not have the kind of deep Protestant sensibilities of loving kindness, but that's okay. And as I said, its near enemy, its far enemy, of course, is unfriendliness or hostility, but its near enemy is partiality. A second one is karuna, which I like care, right? Desire to, this aspiration to alleviate suffering. Its far enemy, of course, is callousness or sadism even. But its near enemy is floppy sympathy.
Right.
Where somebody says, I really want to help them because it makes me feel so bad to see them suffer, right? So the reason is because it makes me feel bad. Yeah. You want a great instance of this? About a year ago, my poor wife broke her arm pretty badly, flying off a horse the wrong way. And we had to go to an urgent care place, and the bone had to be reset, which is an extremely painful thing.
Yes.
And she screamed, and a few minutes later, this nurse in tears came from down the hall and said, I'm so sorry, I was supposed to be in here helping, but I'm such a compassionate person that when I heard how much you hurt, I just couldn't bear to be here. And I thought to myself, there's the near enemy, right? When I'm hurt, I want somebody to care for me. I don't want them to feel my pain, right? So that's the near enemy there. And it feels so good, right? As it felt good to her. It felt like she was super virtuous. Upeksha, somewhere between impartiality and equanimity.
Sometimes my teacher translated it as inclusiveness.
That's perfect.
Which is nice.
That is perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. You know, I've always said somewhere that's perfect. That's perfect. And of course, the far enemy from that is partiality.
Yes.
But the near enemy is just not caring about anybody.
Indifference,
You know, since
right.
nobody has any close relationship to me, the hell with all of them, right? And again, it could feel good. It could say, I've achieved so much detachment that I don't have any emotional attachment to anybody, right? That's just psychopathy.
Yeah.
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 And then the other one is mudita, which doesn't have an easy English translation. So sympathetic joy is what we generally use, right? And the far enemy, of course, is just partiality, right? But the near enemy to
Or
mudita,
Schadenfreude.
yeah, that's right, yeah. And that's the far enemy, Schadenfreude. The near enemy, though, is clannishness, right? It's when I really am happy because this team did well,
Yes.
because they're my team.
That's another kind of self. at a bigger
Exactly,
scale.
a bigger self, but it's still a self.
Still
And again,
identification.
people say, you know, that he's genuinely patriotic or he's a real fan, right? Because it feels so good.
Yeah.
But every one of these, when you look at the difference between the near enemy and the Brahma Vihara, the difference is whether it's egocentric or not.
Yes, it reifies some kind of self.
Some
at
kind of
some
relationship
level.
to myself,
Yes.
yeah. And so it's the way I feel
Yes.
that makes the difference.
Yes.
And as long as we train activists to function through the near enemies, we train them to be not only ineffective, but to be counterproductive.
Yes.
Right? You know, that's why Gandhi argued so hard against the idea of patriotism. Right?
Yes.
He saw that as the near enemy of a wish for liberation. Right? Though he wouldn't have put it exactly that way. So one thing we can do as people who are teaching Buddhist philosophy or Buddhist practice, and I don't think those two things are so far from one another. Somebody in your tradition, Zongmi, said beautifully, may my practice illuminate the Dharma, and may my understanding of the Dharma be bright enough to illuminate my practice. Right?
Beautiful.
These things fit together. What we can do is to help draw those subtle distinctions in experience and understanding to help people become effective rather than feel good counterproductive.
Yes. No, I think that's incredibly helpful. In my contact with, various aspects of the climate movement, youth climate activists and so on, what they are all saying to us is that the biggest problem they face right now is division within the movement, is this sort of circular firing squad phenomenon, which is also forced upon them sometimes by competition for resources, for funding, by seeking for priority, by saying, this is the most important lever that we can pull on, and we have to pull on this lever, and if we pull on any of the other levers, it's to the detriment of this lever. Now, of course, lots of people are realizing, no, we need all of the solutions, and we need all of the creativity, and we need all of the people doing all of the things, and we cannot divide ourselves. We cannot be divided against ourselves, or we shouldn't be. So I think this is really, we do have something really crucial to offer.
Yeah.
And I love the precision of the way that you can articulate that with this lens on the four Brahma viharas. I find that very, very helpful. And the risky sort of attraction of the near enemies. And then it sort of is then calling me to ask myself, what kind of training would we be able to offer to be able to give people, so once we give them that conceptual map, and then how can we sort of touch those things experientially? And I think that we do in the Plum Village tradition offer some aspects of that, but the sort of theoretical mapping of it is going to stimulate me further to sort of think, to kind of map out some exercises that we could do to touch on each of these things. And their near enemies, as you were saying.
The 14 mindfulness trainings come very close to this.
Yes.
I'm always struck by the degree to which the distinctions people draw between the different Buddhist traditions tend to track the superficial rather than the deep. And, when I read Buddhaghosa and I read Thai and I read Shantideva, I'm not reading three alternatives. I'm reading three different ways of getting at many of the same ideas.
Three facets of the same jewel.
Yeah.
And that's what I find here also in this experience, meeting people from other lineages, other traditions. The the overwhelming experience is not of difference, but of closeness, and of recognition and familiarity. Of course, there's differences in sort of the framing,
Yeah,
terms.
that's fine.
Yeah, but underneath that is a very sort of warm sense of closeness, I find.
Yeah, yeah, which is a good thing.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is a good thing.
And then coming back to sort of action, the action dimension. So when, when my teacher did the Zorro, the Z, ultimate and relative, or ultimate and historical, or absolute and conventional, however, he was calling on a chapter from the Lotus Sutra, sort of saying there are not just two dimensions, but there's a third, which he called the action dimension, which is the bodhisattvas, where the bodhisattvas operate. Because the bodhisattvas are people who can touch the ultimate, but are not indifferent to the pain and the suffering of the historical. And so they're able to bring the flavor of the ultimate into their action, into the historical, and that's why they're bodhisattvas.
Yeah.
And so that I find also a very interesting framing for activists, to sort of say, you can, through meditation, touch a kind of freedom from the need for a particular outcome, even human survival.
Exactly.
You can transcend that.
That's
you
right.
can be free from the pressure and the urgency of that, and yet still recognize the urgency and the injustice and the pain.
Yeah.
But what you bring to that urgency and injustice and pain is not more urgency and more anger and judgment and intolerance, but you bring the nectar of compassion. You bring freedom and peace, and that's why you can help others.
It's the difference between desire and aspiration.
Yes, yes, I love that when you pointed that out yesterday.
You just drop the desire and
Yeah.
nourish your aspiration. Shantideva puts that beautifully at the beginning of Bodhicharyavatara, of How to Lead an Awakened Life, in the first chapter, when he distinguishes aspirational bodhicitta from engaged bodhicitta. Because the difference, he said, it's like traveling. Aspirational bodhicitta is like you've read the guidebook, so you know what's there. And engaged bodhicitta, you've actually gone.
Yes.
And so notice that that's the difference between just having a conceptual understanding. Oh yeah, I know there's a really good restaurant there, and this is the best hotel. Yeah, I read TripAdvisor, and says where you could go, right? Somebody says, oh, do you know what the guy is like? Yeah, I read about TripAdvisor, right? And the other is you've actually gone and you've seen it.
Or you're going.
Yeah. So it's the difference between direct perception and inference.
Yes.
And that's why experience is so necessary. I mean, even if we go to the Western tradition, go to Kant, right? Where we get concepts without intuitions are blind. Intuitions without concepts are empty, right? Just seeing doesn't mean anything unless you actually know how to make use of it. That's Tsongkhapa's point.
Yes.
But just thinking doesn't get you anywhere unless you've got a kind of immediate personal engagement.
But I wonder if, in the line of what you were saying about the Brahma viharas having their near enemies, I wonder if bodhicitta, or aspiration, in fact also has the near enemy of kind of,
self-abnegation.
Yeah, self-abnegation, self-sacrifice.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Or kind of like justice of various kinds, involving retribution of various kinds.
Exactly.
So I really enjoy, and I find helpful, the framing for myself of aspiration or bodhicitta as being a present moment phenomenon, which gives me an orientation in the present moment. So I can be pointing in a direction, but I'm not I don't have to be losing myself in the future or making my present moment well-being, happiness dependent on the outcome of some future action, but I'm still engaged, and I can be acting in the present moment, knowing that I'm pointing in a certain direction, and basically the direction, I guess the compass is more or less suffering, and hopefully I'm pointing in the direction of less suffering.
Taking the first derivative of the slope of the path.
Exactly. And I love, in fact, to see the Eightfold Noble Path as this very compass, adding a third dimension, which is the derivative. So for each element of the Noble Eightfold Path, you can go in one or other direction, which is towards or away from awakening, and maybe in the center.
That's cool.
Yeah.
I like that image.
Thank you.
That was fun.
Beautiful ending.